What if the first words ever pressed into clay were not a beginning at all, but a memory? What if the people who invented writing did not write to announce their own world, but to grieve for one that had already vanished? Somewhere beneath the sand of southern Iraq, the oldest sentences on earth lay waiting in the dark for thousands of years, and when scholars at last learned to read them, they found something stranger than they expected. The earliest writers were not describing the dawn of history, they were describing its second chapter. The first, they said, had been swept away. So before you let your body sink fully into this comfort, take a moment to like this video and to subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what is being done here. And if you're listening from somewhere far away tonight, leave your location and your local time in the comments below so we can see how far these old voices have managed to travel. To understand why this is so unsettling, it helps to remember what writing actually is. For most of human existence, there was no way to keep a thought once the mouth that spoke it had fallen silent. A grandmother might pass a story to a grandchild, and that child to another, and so the past survived only as long as breath and memory could carry it. Then, in the floodplains between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in a land the people called Sumer, someone began pressing the end of a cut reed into soft clay. The marks were not pictures of things, they were wedges, small triangular impressions that could be arranged and rearranged to stand for sounds and ideas. Cuneiform, the modern name has it, from the Latin word for wedge. And with those wedges, for the first time, a human voice could outlive the human who carried it. The strange part is what those first voices chose to say. One might imagine that the inventors of writing would begin with something practical, and indeed many of the oldest tablets are nothing more than accounts. Records of barley and beer, of sheep and silver, of debts owed and grain stored. The very first writing on earth was very largely bookkeeping, the patient arithmetic of a society learning to remember its own wealth. There is something humbling in that, the idea that the most powerful technology ever devised began as a way of counting jars. But scattered among those ledgers, and growing through the centuries that followed, were texts of another kind entirely. Lists of kings, hymns to gods, stories of how the world began, and of how more than once it very nearly ended. And in those stories there is a recurring shadow, a line drawn through time that the Sumerians and the peoples who came after them seemed unable to forget. On one side of that line stood their own world, the world of cities and canals and clay tablets. On the other side stood something older, something that had been removed. They spoke of it as the time before the flood, and they spoke of it not as legend but as record, as fact set down in the same dry voice that counted the barley. Here is the world that came after, the tablets seemed to say, but do not imagine it was the first. There was an earlier age, and it ended in water, and almost everything from it was lost. Why would the very inventors of memory begin by confessing how much had already been forgotten? It is the question that haunts anyone who reads these texts closely. A people only just learning to fix words in clay might be forgiven for believing themselves the start of everything. Instead, they wrote, again and again, of a vanished antiquity that dwarfed their own. The numbers they attached to that vanished age were so vast, they have embarrassed scholars for more than a century. And the figures who ruled it were given names and reigns and an order of succession, as though someone somewhere had been keeping count long before anyone was supposed to be able to count at all. There is a temptation to dismiss all of this as the ordinary human habit of inventing a golden age. Every culture, it is said, imagines that the past was grander than the present, that there were giants in the earth in those days. Perhaps that is all this is. Perhaps the Sumerian scribes, like poets everywhere, simply could not resist gilding the centuries they could not see. And yet the texts do not read like nostalgia. They read like inventory. They have the cold precision of a clerk who has been told to write down what is true and to leave the longing out of it. That is the unsettling tone of the oldest literature on earth. It does not sigh for the lost world. It catalogues it. Consider what that would mean. It would mean that at the very moment writing was born, the impulse behind it was not pride but preservation. not look at what we have built, but rather, do not let this be forgotten again. As though the inventors of the written word had learned from some experience they no longer fully understood exactly how fragile a thing memory really is. As though they had already watched a world go dark and silent, and had decided that this time, whatever happened, the record would survive. It is worth sitting with that thought before going further. The history most people carry in their heads is a tidy line. First there were cave painters, then farmers, then cities, then writing, then us, each step rising neatly from the one before. But the people who actually stood at the threshold of writing did not describe a tidy line. They described a break, a before and an after, severed by catastrophe. And when a civilization that has only just learned to speak across time chooses, as its earliest sustained subject, to describe the world that came before its own, perhaps the question is not whether they were exaggerating. Perhaps the question is what exactly they remembered. And in the centuries of tablets that follow, that memory takes a very particular and very strange shape. It begins with a list of names, kings who, it was claimed, had ruled for tens of thousands of years. The list survives, against all odds, on a small four-sided prism of baked clay no larger than a hand. It was acquired in the early 20th century by a collector named Herbert Weld Blundell, and it now rests in a museum in Oxford, and it carries one of the most disorienting documents ever written. Scholars call it the Sumerian King List, and on its surface it is the most ordinary thing imaginable, a record of who ruled and for how long. But the reigns it records do not behave like the reigns of men. After kingship descended from the heavens, the text begins, the first king ruled for a span of time so enormous that the mind refuses to hold it. And the kings who followed him ruled for spans nearly as vast until the whole of that first age stretches across hundreds of thousands of years. There were, by the most familiar version of the list, 8 kings before the flood, ruling from a handful of cities whose names have mostly crumbled out of memory. Eridu, the first of all cities, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shurpak, and the reigns assigned to those 8 kings, when added together, come to something on the order of 240,000 years. Then comes the sentence that divides the entire document in two, the line that turns a dry ledger into something close to scripture. The flood swept over, and after the flood had swept over, the text continues, kingship once again descended from the heavens, and from that point the numbers begin, slowly, to shrink towards something a human life can recognize. What is to be made of 240,000 years of kings? The easy answer, and for a long time the only respectable one, was that the figures are pure invention, the boasting of a young civilization dressing its origins in borrowed grandeur. And the easy answer may well be correct. But it has never fully silenced the harder questions that cluster around the list. Why, for instance, are the antediluvian reigns not random? Several scholars have noticed that the numbers can be read as multiples of certain base figures rooted in the Sumerian counting system, a system built not on 10 but on 60, the same system that still divides an hour into 60 minutes and a circle into 360 degrees. The vast reigns, in other words, may be a kind of code, a deliberate mathematical inflation rather than a fevered guess. Someone sat down and calculated these impossible lifespans. They did not simply dream them, and there is the matter of the flood itself sitting at the exact centre of the document like a hinge. Everything before it is monstrous in scale and shrouded in the language of the divine. Everything after it grows steadily more human, more dated, more checkable against other records, until the later kings of the list can be matched name for name against rulers known from independent sources to have truly existed. The list, in other words, is not all fantasy. Its later half is, broadly, history, which leaves the unanswerable question of where exactly the fantasy ends and the history begins, and whether that dividing flood was only a literary device, or the dim recollection of something that had actually happened to the land between the rivers. Those who first studied the list assumed the long rains belonged entirely to myth, the kind of decoration any people might add to make their origins feel weightier. But there is a quieter possibility that has never quite gone away. What if the enormous spans were not meant to describe individual men at all? What if each antediluvian king was a placeholder, a single name standing in for a whole dynasty, or a whole era whose true length had been lost? A people who had forgotten almost everything about the deep past, but who knew, somehow, that it had been very long, might compress that immensity into a single towering figure and call him a king. The number would then be honest in its way. It would be a confession of scale. It would be saying in the only grammar available that what came before lasted far longer than what we can remember. The cities named in that first age deepen the mystery rather than resolving it. Eridu, listed as the place where kingship first touched the earth, was a real city, and not merely a legendary one. Its ruins were excavated in southern Iraq, and beneath the later temples, archaeologists found layer upon layer of earlier shrines, each built directly on the foundations of the one before, reaching down through the centuries toward the very beginnings of settled life in the region. The Sumerians who wrote the king list were not inventing Eridu. They were pointing to a place they could still walk to, a mound already ancient in their own time, and saying, "There, that is where it started." The oldest holy ground we know of, the first place the gods chose, so the list cannot be waved away as simple fiction, because it is braided together with real places and, in its later sections, real men. And it cannot be accepted as record because no human reigns for 36,000 years. It exists in the uncomfortable middle, a document that is half memory and half something else, and that insists with its quiet clerical certainty that there was a world before the flood, that it was ruled and ordered and named, and that it was almost entirely erased. The scribes who copied and recopied the list across the centuries clearly believed this division mattered. They preserved it faithfully, the impossible numbers and the dividing flood and all, as though it were the single most important thing their ancestors had passed down. And perhaps the most disquieting detail is the smallest one. The flood swept over, the list says, and then says almost nothing more about it. No explanation, no cause, no survivors named in that terse central line. The single most catastrophic event in the Sumerian account of their own past is recorded in just a few wedges of clay, as though the writer either did not know the details or assumed every reader already did. It is the silence at the heart of the oldest list of kings on earth. A flood that ended an age, mentioned in passing, as if everyone still remembered. And the question that silence leaves behind is the one that pulls the listener onward into the dark. If the flood was real enough to need no explanation, then what exactly did it drown? The answer, or at least the longing for an answer, survives in a story the Sumerians and their heirs told over and over, until it had spread across the whole of the ancient Near East and far beyond it. It is the story of a single man warned in secret that the waters were coming, told to build a vessel to gather the seed of living things and to ride out the destruction of the world. The shape of that story is so familiar that it is easy to forget how astonishing it is to find it written down in the oldest literature on the planet, long before the version most people know was ever set to parchment. In the Sumerian telling, the survivor is sometimes called Zeus-Sudra, a name that can be read as something like he who laid hold on life of distant days. In the later Babylonian poem, the Atrahasis, the survivor is Atrahasis himself, whose name means the exceedingly wise. And in the great epic of Gilgamesh, the survivor is an old man named Utnapishtim, whom the hero seeks out at the very edge of the world to learn the secret of how he, alone among mortals, escaped death and the flood. 3 names, 3 tellings, 1 event. A god, moved by pity or by second thoughts, leans close to a reed wall and whispers a warning to a single human being. Build a boat. Abandon your possessions. Save what lives. The destruction is coming, and it will not spare the world you know. The details that recur across these versions are what make them so hard to dismiss as mere coincidence of imagination. In more than one telling, the survivor sends out birds to test whether the waters have receded, a raven, a dove, a swallow, watching to see which returns and which does not. In more than one telling, the vessel comes to rest at last upon a mountain. In more than one telling, the survivor, on stepping back onto dry land, offers a sacrifice, and the gods gather to it like flies, suddenly aware of how close they had come to destroying the very creatures who fed them. Anyone raised within reach of the biblical story of Noah will feel a strange vertigo reading these lines, because the Mesopotamian versions are older, in some cases by more than 1,000 years. The flood that ends the antediluvian world was being written down on clay, while the ancestors of the later scribes were still wandering with their flocks. For a long time this was treated as a literary puzzle, a question of who borrowed what from whom. But in the early 20th century the puzzle briefly became something more physical. A British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley was excavating the ancient city of the same remembered in scripture as the home of Abraham. Digging down through the layers of human occupation, his workers reached a stratum that stopped them. Beneath the rubbish and brick of the city lay a thick band of clean water laid silt, several feet of it, sediment of the kind left behind by a great inundation. And beneath that silt, the signs of human life resumed. Woolley, standing at the bottom of his trench, is said to have concluded almost at once that he had found the flood, the very deluge of the Sumerian tablets in the book of Genesis. Written not in clay this time, but in the earth itself. The truth, as later work showed, was more complicated and in some ways more interesting. The flood layer at was real, but it was local. The record of a single catastrophic overflow of the rivers, rather than a drowning of the whole world. And other cities in the region showed flood layers too, but at different depths and different dates, the marks of different floods in different centuries. The land between the Tigris and the Euphrates is a flat alluvial plain, and such plains are made by floods, built up over millennia from the silt that great rivers carry down and abandon. To live there at all was to live with the knowledge that the water could rise without warning and take everything. The flood of the tablets, then, may not be the memory of one event, but the distillation of 1,000. The way a people who live perpetually at the mercy of the rivers might fold all their terror into a single archetypal catastrophe and place it at the boundary of memory itself. And yet that explanation, satisfying as it is, leaves a residue. It accounts for why the people of Mesopotamia would dread a flood and dream of one. It does not fully account for why they placed that flood so precisely at the seam between two ages, why they made it the event that severed an entire forgotten world from their own. Nor does it explain why the same fundamental story, a chosen survivor, a vessel, a renewal of life after the water's fall, appears in cultures that never traded a single tablet with Sumer. The flood is remembered in India, where a fish warns the sage Manu and tows his boat to safety. It is remembered in Greece, where Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a flood sent by Zeus and repopulate the earth. It is remembered in the Americas and China, in the islands of the Pacific, in forms too varied to be simple borrowings, yet too similar to feel entirely unrelated. The whole of humanity, it sometimes seems, carries the same scar. There is a sober explanation for this too, and it deserves its due. The end of the last ice age, some 12,000 years ago, was a time of genuinely catastrophic flooding across the entire planet. As the great ice sheets melted, sea levels rose by more than 100 meters, drowning coastlines where people had lived for generations. Vast meltwater lakes burst their natural dams and emptied across continents in a matter of days. Whole landscapes that had been dry refuge during the cold became seabed. If there is a single physical reality behind the worldwide memory of a flood, it may be this slow, terrifying, planet-wide rising of the waters, witnessed and survived and passed down by the scattered bands of humanity who lived through the drowning of the world they had known. But notice what that explanation quietly concedes. It admits that the flood myths might be true memories after all, not of a single supernatural deluge, but of a real and global catastrophe, witnessed by real human beings and carried forward across hundreds of generations until it surfaced, at last, in the oldest writing on Earth. If that is so, then the antediluvian world the Sumerians described was not pure invention. It was the world before the ice melted. And the people who first learned to write may have been, without quite knowing it, the inheritors of a memory far older than their cities, far older than their gods, reaching all the way back to the cold and the drowning that ended the only world their distant ancestors had ever known. The question that remains is who, in that lost world, was supposed to have taught them anything worth remembering. And the answer the tablets give is the strangest part of all, for the Mesopotamians did not believe that civilization had been won slowly by trial and patience, the way it is described in modern textbooks. They believed it had been given, delivered, fully formed, by beings who came from somewhere else, and who belonged to the time before the flood. The clearest account of this belief was written not in Sumerian or Babylonian, but in Greek, by a Babylonian priest named Berossus, who lived in the centuries after Alexander the Great, and who set out to explain his people's ancient knowledge to the Hellenistic world. His original work has been lost, but fragments of it survive, quoted by later writers, and what those fragments describe is unforgettable. In the first year Berossus wrote, there appeared from the sea, in the place where Babylonia bordered the waters, a creature of strange and composite form. It had the body of a fish, but beneath the fish's head there was another head, a human one, and it had human feet, and it spoke in a human voice. By day it came up from the sea to teach, and at night it returned to the deep, for it could not bear to remain among men. This being, whom the Greeks called Oan, gave to humanity the whole of civilization. It taught them writing and the sciences and every kind of skill. It taught them how to build cities and raise temples, how to make laws and measure land, how to gather seed and harvest crops. Until that time, Berossus says, men had lived without order, like animals. And after Oans had given them everything, it added nothing further, for nothing further was needed. Oans, in the older Mesopotamian sources that lie behind Berossus, was not alone. He was the first and greatest of a group of 7, beings the Sumerians and Babylonians called the Apkallu, the sages. They were creatures of the deep, associated with the god of fresh water and wisdom whom the Sumerians named Enki, and the Babylonians named Ea, the same god whose temple stood at Eridu, the first of all cities. The Apkallu were said to have lived before the flood, and to have served as counsellors to the antediluvian kings, one sage standing beside each throne, guiding the ordering of the world. They appear again and again in Mesopotamian art, carved on palace walls and pressed into protective figurines buried beneath the floors of houses, rendered as bearded men cloaked in the skin of a fish, the fish's head rising above their own like a hood, the tail trailing down their backs. For thousands of years, the people of Mesopotamia surrounded themselves with images of these fish-cloaked teachers, as though their presence still offered protection long after the world that bore them had drowned. What is to be made of a civilization that did not claim to have invented itself, but insisted instead that everything it knew had been handed to it by beings from before the flood? It is the precise opposite of the story modern people tell about progress. There is no slow climb in the Mesopotamian account, no gradual accumulation of trial and error. There is a gift, complete and final, delivered at the very beginning by something that came out of the water and went back into it. And there is the unmistakable implication that the High Age was the first age, that knowledge has not been growing since the dawn of time, but rather has been struggling, ever since the flood, to recover what was lost. The Apkallu belonged to the world before. The scholars who came after, the human experts the Babylonians called Umanu, were their diminished successors, working from fragments, reaching back toward a wisdom they could no longer fully reach. And then there is the detail that turns the whole account from theology into something that feels almost like a deliberate message across time. In the version of the flood story that Berossus preserved, the survivor, whom he calls Sisuthros, is warned by the god not only to build his vessel but to do something else first. He is told to take all the writings, the beginnings, middles and ends of all knowledge, and to bury them in the city of the sun, in Sippar before the waters come. So the survivor buries the sum of human knowledge in the ground, rides out the destruction of the world, and afterward, when the flood has receded and life resumes, the writings are dug up again, recovered from the earth, and given back to the survivors so that civilization can begin once more. The flood erases the world, but the knowledge is saved by being hidden underground, sealed against the catastrophe, waiting to be unearthed by whoever survives. It is impossible to read that without a shiver of recognition. Whether or not such a buried library ever existed, the story is a perfect description of what writing itself is for. It is a way of burying knowledge against catastrophe, a way of sealing a thought in a medium harder than memory, so that even if the speakers die and the cities fall and the world ends, the words might still be there, in the ground, waiting for someone to dig them up. The Mesopotamians, in telling the tale of Xisuthros and the buried tablets of Sippar, may have been describing the deepest motive behind their own greatest invention. They wrote on clay because clay endures. They buried their archives because the earth keeps what the air would scatter, and they remembered in story after story that a world had already been lost once, and that the only thing which had survived it was the written record, pulled from the ground after the waters fell. This raises a question that the tablets themselves cannot answer but cannot stop suggesting. If the people who invented writing believed that their knowledge was inherited from a vanished antediluvian world, where did that belief come from? It is one thing for a culture to imagine glorious ancestors. It is another stranger thing for a culture to insist in its sober record-keeping that its sciences and arts were not its own achievements, but salvage, recovered fragments of an earlier and greater age. That is not the boast of a confident young civilization. It is the testimony of the people who felt themselves to be living among ruins in the long afternoon of something that had already had its morning. Modern scholarship, of course, offers a measured reply to all of this. The Apkallu, it says, are mythological figures, personifications of the prestige of ancient learning. The fish-cloak marks them as creatures of the freshwater deep. The Abzu, the underground ocean from which the Mesopotamians believed all wisdom flowed. The story of buried and recovered writings is a charter myth, a way of explaining why the oldest texts were held in such reverence, by claiming they predated even the flood. There is no need, this reply concludes, to imagine any literal vanished civilization. The whole structure is symbolic, a culture's way of saying that its knowledge was old and sacred and not to be questioned. That reply is reasonable and it may be entirely correct, but it does not quite dissolve the unease because it does not explain the particular shape of the symbol. Of all the ways a culture might dignify its learning, why this one? Why a teacher who comes from the sea gives everything at once and adds nothing afterward? Why a flood that severs the age of the teachers from the age of their pupils? Why a buried archive, saved underground, recovered after the catastrophe? Each of these elements describes not growth, but recovery. Not invention, but inheritance. Not the rise of a new world, but the salvaging of an old one. The symbol, whatever its origin, points relentlessly backward, toward a fullness that was lost. And a culture that tells itself over and over that the best of its knowledge was given long ago and then nearly destroyed, is a culture haunted by the suspicion that it is not the first. So the oldest writing on earth, read closely, does not describe a beginning. It describes an aftermath. It speaks of kings before the flood, of sages who came from the water, of knowledge buried and recovered, of a world that was complete before this one and that was taken away. Whether any of it happened in the way the textbooks would demand is a question the clay cannot settle. But the texts agree on one thing with a consistency that is hard to ignore. They agree that something came before, and the deeper one descends into the question of where writing truly came from, the more that ancient insistence begins to seem less like a myth and more like a memory with the edges worn off. To follow that descent honestly means setting aside the tablets for a moment and asking a harder question, one that has troubled scholars of the ancient Near East for over a century. Where did writing actually come from? Not the legend of it, but the fact of it. And the honest answer is that no one fully knows, and that the more carefully the evidence is examined, the stranger the story becomes. For most of the 20th century, the standard account of writing's birth was elegant and reassuring. It began, the story went, with counting. Long before cities, the farmers and traders of the ancient Near East kept track of their goods using small clay tokens, little shaped pieces of fired earth, a cone for a measure of grain, a sphere for a larger measure, a cylinder for an animal, each shape standing for a thing and a quantity. A herder sending sheep to market might seal a matching set of tokens inside a hollow clay ball, a sort of tamper-proof envelope, so that the recipient could break it open and verify the count. Over time, someone realized that the shapes could be pressed onto the outside of the ball before it was sealed, so the contents could be read without breaking it. And then came the decisive leap. If the marks on the outside conveyed the information, the tokens inside were unnecessary. The container flattened into a tablet. The pressed shapes became signs and writing. On this account was born from accounting, a slow and entirely practical evolution from counting things to recording them. It is a beautiful theory, developed most fully by the scholar Denise Schmant-Besserat, and there is real evidence for it. Thousands of tokens and sealed clay envelopes recovered across the Near East. But it explains less than it first appears to. It can account for how a sign for sheep or grain might emerge from a token for sheep or grain. It cannot easily account for the moment when those signs stopped representing only things and began to represent sounds. The moment when a picture of an object was used not for the object but for the syllable that named it, so that the sign for an arrow, which in Sumerian was pronounced T, could be borrowed to write the word for life, which was also pronounced T. That leap from picture to phonetics is the true birth of writing, the point at which marks stop standing for things and begin standing for language itself. And that leap, in the archaeological record, happens with startling speed. The earliest substantial writing comes from the city of Uruk, in the south of what is now Iraq, in the centuries around 3,200 years before the Common Era. Uruk in this period was the largest settlement the world had yet seen, a city of perhaps tens of thousands, with monumental temples and a complex bureaucracy, and it is from its administrative quarter that the oldest known tablets emerge. They are called proto-cuneiform, and they are already a system, with hundreds of distinct signs, with conventions for arranging them, with a logic that scribes had to be trained to use. There is no long, visible apprenticeship in the ground, no thick layer of clumsy early attempts gradually improving over centuries. The oldest writing we can find is already, by any reasonable measure, writing. It arrives, as the Apkallu were said to arrive, very nearly complete. This is the quiet anomaly at the centre of the subject, and specialists are well aware of it, though it rarely reaches the public. The transition from no writing to functioning writing, as preserved in the surviving record, is extraordinarily compressed. Either the earlier, fumbling stages were written on materials that did not survive, on wood or leather or wax or some perishable medium long since rotted away, which is entirely possible and probably true to some degree, or the system was developed deliberately and rapidly by a small group of people who understood exactly what they were trying to build, which is also possible, and in some ways even stranger. A handful of administrators in a single city, inventing in a generation or two a technology that would outlast every empire and reshape the entire species. Either way, the smooth evolutionary climb of the textbooks does not quite match what comes out of the ground. Writing does not dawn, it switches on, and it may have switched on more than once. There is a small, much debated artifact known as the Kish tablet, a fragment of limestone bearing scratched pictographic signs, recovered from the city of Kish, and dated by some to slightly before even the earliest Uruk tablets. Its signs are cruder, more pictorial, harder to connect cleanly to the later cuneiform system. Some see it as the single oldest written object in the world, a glimpse of the very first stirrings. Others see it as something more ambiguous, marks that may not be true writing at all. It sits at the blurred frontier where it becomes impossible to say with confidence whether a given set of marks is writing, or merely the ancestor of writing, the threshold itself rather than anything cleanly on one side of it. That frontier matters because it forces a confrontation with a question that sounds simple and is not. What precisely counts as writing? If marks must record actual language, full sentences with grammar that can be read back aloud, then writing is young, no more than 5,000 years old or so. But if writing means any system of marks that deliberately and conventionally carries meaning across time, then the picture grows far older and far stranger, because there are marks like that scattered across the world long before Uruk, long before Sumer, reaching back into ages that are not supposed to have had writing at all. And the people who first pressed reeds into clay in the south of Iraq may not have been the inventors of the impulse so much as the perfecters of it, the ones who finally caught and tamed something that human beings had been reaching toward in fragments and false starts for a very long time. Here the story circles back to the strange testimony of the tablets themselves. The Mesopotamians believed their writing was a gift from before the flood, from the Apkallu, from the time of the long-lived kings, and the archaeology, read without prejudice, returns a verdict that is not quite a contradiction. Writing, it says, appears suddenly, nearly complete, with its deepest origins lost in materials that did not survive, or in a leap too fast to fully trace. The legend says the knowledge was inherited and recovered. The evidence says the knowledge arrives without a clear childhood. These are not the same claim, but they rhyme. And once that rhyme is heard, it becomes very difficult to look at the oldest marks human beings ever made and feel certain that the story begins where the textbooks say it begins. Because long before the scribes of Uruk pressed their first wedge into clay, other hands, in other places, were already making marks that meant something. And some of those marks are old enough to unsettle the entire timeline. Far from the rivers of Mesopotamia, in the valleys of the Balkans, there lived a people whom no one remembers by any name they gave themselves. Archaeologists call them the Vinca culture, after a site near Belgrade where their remains were first studied, and they flourished across southeastern Europe more than 7,000 years ago, 2,000 years and more before the first tablets of Uruk. They built large villages, worked copper among the earliest peoples ever to do so, and shaped clay into figurines of haunting, mask-like faces. And on a great many of their objects, on pots and spindle whorls and small clay tablets, they incised marks, combs and ladders and crosses and chevrons, arranged in deliberate groupings, repeated with evident intention across hundreds of miles and hundreds of years. Scholars call them the Vinca symbols, and no one can read them, and no one can agree on what they are. The fiercest debate surrounds 3 small clay tablets unearthed in the 1960s at a place called Tartaria in Transylvania. They're covered in incised signs, and they were found in association with material that radiocarbon dating placed astonishingly early, by some readings older than the Sumerian writing they superficially resemble. When the discovery was announced, it caused something close to scandal. Here, it seemed, was writing in the heart of old Europe, predating the supposed birthplace of writing in the Near East. The implications were enormous. If true, they would mean that the cradle of writing was not where everyone believed it to be, and that the conventional map of how civilization spread, outward from Mesopotamia like ripples from a stone, was simply wrong. The reaction of mainstream scholarship was swift and largely dismissive, and not without reason. The Tartaria tablets, the critics argued, were probably not writing at all in the full sense, not a system encoding spoken language, but rather symbols, perhaps religious or magical, perhaps a record-keeping device, perhaps mere decoration with a grammar of its own that had nothing to do with speech. The dating was questioned, the context disputed, the resemblance to Sumerian signs dismissed as coincidence, since simple marks like crosses and chevrons can arise independently anywhere. And so the orthodox account held. The Vinca symbols are not writing, they are proto-writing, or pre-writing, or sinews, or anything except the real thing, which still belongs safely to Sumer. But the word proto conceals more than it reveals. It is a way of acknowledging that a people were doing something with symbols, something systematic and meaningful, while denying that the something quite counts. And the more one looks, the more such not quite writing turns up, scattered across the deep past in places that are not supposed to have it. At a site called Dispelio in northern Greece, a wooden tablet was recovered from a waterlogged lakeside settlement, incised with markings and dated to more than 7,000 years ago, preserved only because the mud sealed it from the air. In China, at a Neolithic site called Jiahu, tortoise shells and bones were found bearing carved signs older than 8,000 years, some of which bear an uncanny resemblance to characters that would appear in genuine Chinese writing thousands of years later, though whether there is any true connection across that vast gulf of time remains hotly contested. Again and again, in the millennia before writing was supposed to exist, human beings were carving deliberate, repeated, meaningful marks into clay and bone and wood. What were they doing? The cautious answer is that they were not writing language, and the cautious answer is probably right. There is little sign that these marks recorded sentences, that they could be read aloud, that they encoded the grammar of speech the way true writing does. But that very caution exposes how narrow the definition of writing has become. For the people who made these marks, the symbols surely meant something. They were not random, they recurred. They were placed with care on objects of importance, in patterns that the makers and their communities could presumably interpret. A symbol that everyone in a village understands to mean a particular clan, or a particular spirit, or a particular promise, is doing much of the work that writing does, even if it never touches the sound of a single spoken word. The boundary between such symbol systems and true writing is real, but it is also, on inspection, a boundary that human beings seem to have been crossing and recrossing for a very long time, in many places, independently. This is the quiet correction that the deep past keeps offering to the tidy story of a single invention in a single place. The impulse to fix meaning in durable marks is not a sudden spark struck once in Mesopotamia. It is something humanity reached for over and over, across continents, across thousands of years, with varying success and varying ambition. The Sumerians may have been the first to fully complete the leap, to bind their marks all the way to spoken language, and so create a system that could record anything that could be said. But they were not the first to feel the longing behind it. That longing is older than their cities, older than their gods, older than the flood they could not stop describing. It runs back through the Vinca villages and the Jiahu shells and the Dispelio tablet, back toward an origin that no one can quite locate, because every time the search seems to be closing in on the first marks, older ones appear, a little further back, a little harder to read, and there is a particular vertigo in confronting the oldest of these symbol systems, because they raise a possibility that polite scholarship prefers to leave unspoken. If human beings were carving meaningful, systematic symbols 7,000 and 8,000 years ago in scattered places with no apparent contact between them, then the capacity and the desire to record meaning across time is not a late achievement of complex urban societies. It is something far more deeply rooted in the species, something that may have been present in some form for as long as there have been people clever enough to wish that a thought might outlast them. The question then is not when writing was invented. The question is how far back the wish to write actually goes, and to answer that, one must leave the world of clay and bone behind entirely, and travel to a hillside in the south of Turkey, to the oldest monument human beings ever raised, built by people who had no cities, no pottery, no farming, and no writing of any kind that anyone has been able to name, and yet who carved, into great pillars of stone, a set of symbols that have left every expert who studies them reaching for words. On a barren ridge in southeastern Turkey, near the city of Sanliurfa, there is a hill called Göbekli Tepe, the pot-bellied hill, named for its rounded shape. For thousands of years it was nothing but a low mound covered in broken limestone, and farmers cursed it for the rocks that blunted their ploughs. Then, in the 1990s, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began to dig there. and what he uncovered overturned a fundamental assumption about the human story. Beneath the hill lay great rings of massive stone pillars, T-shaped, some of them 5 meters tall and weighing many tons, arranged in deliberate circles and carved, many of them with astonishing reliefs of animals, foxes and boars, snakes and scorpions, vultures and cranes, rendered with a confidence and skill that no one expected from the people who made them. And the people who made them, the radiocarbon dates insisted, lived around 11,600 years ago. To grasp why that number stunned the field, one must hold it against the accepted sequence of human development. The standard story said that monumental architecture comes late, that you cannot raise great stone temples until you have agriculture to produce surplus food and settled towns to house the labour and social hierarchy to organise it, and that all of this comes only after the long, slow transition from hunting and gathering to farming. Göbekli Tepe broke that sequence in half. It was built by hunter-gatherers. There was no agriculture yet, or only its very faintest beginnings. There was no pottery. There were no metal tools, no wheel, no writing. There was no city anywhere on earth. And yet these people, with nothing but stone tools and their own bodies, quarried and shaped and raised pillars weighing as much as a loaded truck, and they did it not once but repeatedly, building ring after ring over many centuries. Schmidt came to believe he had found not a settlement but a sanctuary, a place of gathering and ritual, and he proposed something that inverted the textbook entirely. Perhaps it was not farming that gave rise to religion and monuments. Perhaps it was the desire to build and to worship that drew people together in numbers great enough to make farming necessary in the first place. First the temple, then the city, the opposite of everything that had been taught. That alone would make Göbekli Tepe one of the most important discoveries in the history of archaeology. But it is the carvings that haunt. The animals are not random decoration. They are chosen, arranged, repeated, and certain pillars seem to carry compositions of striking deliberateness. The most famous of them, known to researchers as Pillar 43 or the Vulture Stone, presents a scene that has provoked years of argument. A great vulture spreads its wings, and on one wing it appears to balance or carry a disc. Around it are other creatures, a scorpion, a snake, birds, and below, a headless figure. To most archaeologists, this is a religious or mythological scene, its meaning lost with the people who carved it. But to others, it is something far more specific. A pair of researchers propose that the animals on the Vulture Stone are not merely animals, but symbols of constellations, and that the scene records a particular event in the sky, a moment when a swarm of comet fragments struck the earth, an interpretation they tied to the very period in which the pillar was carved. The headless figure in this reading marks catastrophe and death. The disc on the vulture's wing is the sun, fixing the date through the position of the stars. The proposal is deeply contested, and the cautions against it are serious. The animals may simply be animals. The constellation identifications depend on choices that other experts find arbitrary. Reading a precise astronomical date out of a Stone Age carving is the kind of claim that demands extraordinary evidence, and many specialists do not believe the evidence is there. And yet the proposal will not quite die because of what surrounds it. The era when Göbekli Tepe was built was, in fact, a time of violent global upheaval, the threshold of a sudden climate catastrophe whose cause is itself debated, and which some scientists have attributed to exactly the kind of cosmic impact the Vulture Stone might be thought to record. Whether or not those particular hunter-gatherers carved the memory of a comet into stone, they lived at the edge of a real and terrible transformation of the world. They were not living in the placid dawn of things, they were living at the end of an age. And then there is the strangest fact of all about Göbekli Tepe, the one that connects it back to the buried tablets of Sippar and the long Mesopotamian obsession with knowledge saved underground. The site was not abandoned, it was buried. Deliberately, intentionally, the people who built these great stone rings filled them in, packing them with rubble and debris and earth until the pillars were entombed, and the whole complex vanished beneath the hill. This is why it survived so well, why the carvings are so crisp, why Schmidt could read them 11,000 years later. The makers themselves sealed their monument in the ground. No one knows why. Perhaps the rings were ritually closed when their purpose was fulfilled. Perhaps each generation buried the work of the last and built anew. But the result is that the oldest monument on Earth was, like the antediluvian archive of the legends, hidden in the earth by the very people who made it, and recovered only in our own time, after more than 10,000 years of darkness. What were they trying to say, these people without writing, who carved a bestiary into stone and then buried it? They left no words, or none that can be read, but they left marks, deliberate and meaningful and arranged with care, on the most monumental surfaces they could create, and then they protected those marks by sealing them away. If the impulse to write is the impulse to fix meaning against forgetting, then Göbekli Tepe may be among its earliest surviving expressions, older than Sumer by 6,000 years. And it stands at the threshold of a catastrophe so severe that it may explain why the world's oldest stories, when they were finally written, so often began not with a beginning, but with an ending. For the age that closed while those pillars were being raised did not fade gently. It ended in a 1,000-year plunge into cold and chaos, a disruption so abrupt and so global that scientists are still arguing about what caused it, and there are those who believe that the memory of that disruption, the memory of the world that ended then, is the true and final source of every flood myth, every lost golden age, every insistence in the oldest writing that there was a world before this one. Roughly 12,900 years ago, as the last great ice age was finally loosening its grip, and the world was warming toward the comfortable climate in which all of recorded history would later unfold, something went catastrophically wrong. The warming reversed. In a span that may have been as short as a single human lifetime, perhaps even shorter, the northern hemisphere plunged back into bitter cold, nearly as cold as the depths of the ice age itself. This abrupt and brutal return of winter to a world that had been thawing is known to science as the Younger Dryas, named for a small Arctic flower whose pollen, found in sediment layers, marks the return of the cold. It lasted more than 1,000 years, and then just as abruptly it ended, and the warming resumed, and within a few thousand years the first cities were rising in Mesopotamia. The Younger Dryas was the last convulsion of the old frozen world before the birth of everything we call civilization. What caused it remains one of the live controversies of Earth science. The mainstream explanation is itself dramatic. As the ice sheets melted, vast volumes of cold fresh water accumulated in enormous glacial lakes, dammed by walls of ice. When one of those dams gave way, the prevailing view holds, a torrent of fresh water poured into the North Atlantic, disrupting the ocean currents that carry warmth northward and plunging the region back into cold. This is sober, well-supported science, and it requires no comet, no catastrophe from the sky. But it does require something worth pausing on. It requires the sudden, violent release of a flood of almost unimaginable scale, a wall of meltwater draining across a continent and into the sea, fundamentally reordering the climate of the planet. Even the cautious explanation, in other words, places a colossal flood at the exact hinge between the old world and the new. There is a bolder explanation, and it is one of the most fiercely disputed ideas in modern science. A group of researchers has argued that the Younger Dryas was triggered not by meltwater alone, but by a cosmic impact, a comet or asteroid that broke apart and struck or exploded over the northern ice sheets, throwing up debris, igniting widespread fires, and triggering the abrupt cooling. In support of this, they point to a thin, dark layer found at sites across North America and beyond, a layer they call the black mat, and within it they report finding markers they associate with impacts, microscopic diamonds formed under intense pressure, tiny spheres of melted rock, elevated levels of the rare metal platinum. Above this layer, the great beasts of the Ice Age, the mammoths and mastodons and giant sloths and saber-toothed cats, largely vanish from the record. Below it, they thrive. The impact hypothesis proposes in effect that a fire from the sky helped end the Ice Age world, wiped out its largest animals, and perhaps devastated the human populations who lived among them. The hypothesis is contested at every point. Critics argue that the supposed impact markers can be produced by ordinary processes, that the dating is inconsistent across sites, that no crater of the right age and size has ever been found, that the megafauna extinctions were already underway and owe more to climate and to human hunting than to any catastrophe from space. The debate has been bitter and is far from settled, and a careful listener should hold the impact hypothesis as exactly that, a hypothesis, unproven and seriously challenged. But what neither side disputes is the underlying reality. Something happened 12,900 years ago that reorganized the world. The climate lurched, the great animals died. The way of life that humanity had followed for hundreds of thousands of years, the long age of the hunters who tracked the herds across a colder earth, came to its end. And on the far side of that 1,000-year darkness, when the warmth returned, human beings began doing something they had never done before. They settled down, they farmed, they built, they eventually wrote. Place the human evidence beside the geological evidence and a haunting alignment emerges. Göbekli Tepe was being raised by hunter-gatherers right at the close of the Younger Dryas, at the moment the old world was giving way to the new. The first experiments with agriculture appear in the same region at almost exactly the same time, as though people, having survived a cataclysm that shattered their ancient way of living, were driven to invent an entirely new one. And thousands of years later, when those people's distant descendants finally learned to write, the first thing they felt compelled to record, again and again, was the memory of a world that had been destroyed by water, an age that had ended in flood and catastrophe, severed forever from their own. Could it be that the oldest stories are not myths at all, but the worn-down memory of the Younger Dryas itself, the real cataclysm that ended the real world of the ancient hunters, passed mouth to mouth across hundreds of generations until it was finally pressed into clay? It is a seductive idea, and it must be handled with care because the gap is enormous. Between the end of the Younger Dryas and the first written flood story lies something like 7,000 or 8,000 years. That is an immense distance for any memory to cross unbroken, longer than all of recorded history laid end to end and doubled. Most scholars would say that no specific memory could possibly survive such a span, that the resemblance between ancient catastrophe and ancient myth is coincidence, or, at most, the natural human tendency to imagine that the world was once ended and remade. And they may be right. But there are those who note that oral traditions can be astonishingly durable, that certain Aboriginal Australian stories appear to preserve accurate memory of coastlines that were drowned by rising seas at the end of the Ice Age, memories that would have to be many thousands of years old to be true. If such memory is possible at all, then the door, however slightly, stays open. And the door stays open in another civilization too, one that kept its own deep records and that claimed in writing of great antiquity to remember an age before the age of men. For while Mesopotamia was raising its cities on the plain between the rivers, far to the southwest, along the green thread of another great river, the Egyptians were assembling king lists of their own. And like the Sumerians, the Egyptians did not begin their reckoning of the past with human beings. They began it with gods, and with demigods, and with the followers of a falcon-headed god named Horus. Being said to have ruled the land of Egypt for thousands upon thousands of years before the first human pharaoh ever took the throne. In a museum in Turin there is a fragile sheet of papyrus, broken into more than 150 pieces, brown and crumbling, that ranks among the most important documents to survive from ancient Egypt. It is known as the Turin Royal Canon, or the Turin King List, written during the reign of Rameses II more than 3,000 years ago, and it sets out to do something the Egyptians clearly considered essential. It lists the kings of Egypt, in order, with the lengths of their reigns, stretching back through the dynasties toward the beginning. For the historical pharaohs, the document is a treasure, one of the backbones of Egyptian chronology. But it is the top of the list. the oldest portion, that stops the reader cold. Before the human kings, the papyrus records the reigns of gods, and before or among the gods, it records other rulers and assigns to them reigns of staggering length, spans of thousands of years, a structure that mirrors with eerie precision the structure of the Sumerian king list half a world away. The Egyptians, like the Mesopotamians, did not imagine that their civilization had begun with themselves. They believed that in the deep past the land had been ruled directly by the gods, by Ra and Osiris and Horus and the rest, and that after the age of the gods came an age of demigods or divine spirits, and only after that, descending at last into time as we know it, came the first mortal kings. The same threefold descent appears in the work of an Egyptian priest named Manetho, who, like the Babylonian Brossus and at roughly the same period, wrote a history of his people for the Greek-speaking world. Manetho's original is lost, but later writers preserved his framework and it is unmistakable. First, the dynasties of the gods, ruling for many thousands of years. Then the dynasties of the demigods and the spirits of the dead. And finally the dynasties of human kings, the pharaohs whose monuments still stand. Two great civilizations, with no clear contact at the time their traditions formed, both insisting that human history was merely the latest and lowest chapter of a far longer story, the surface of a sea whose depths reach back into ages ruled by other kinds of beings. There is a particular phrase in the Egyptian sources that has fascinated and troubled readers for generations. Among the rulers said to precede the human pharaohs were beings the Egyptians called the Shem-Su-Hor, the followers of Horus. The phrase appears in the Turin canon and elsewhere, and these followers of Horus were understood to have governed Egypt in the long twilight between the age of the gods and the dawn of the dynasties, the demigods who bridged the divine past and the human present. Who were they? The cautious reading is that they are mythological, a category invented to fill the unfathomable gap between the gods and the first king, a way of saying that the kingship was ancient and sacred and divinely descended. But the Shem-Su-Hor have always attracted a bolder reading, in which they are taken as the dim memory of a real pre-dynastic culture, a sophisticated people who ruled the Nile Valley in the ages before recorded Egyptian history, and whose achievements were later remembered, with the edges blurred by time, as the works of half-divine beings. The orthodox response to all of this is the same response offered to the Sumerian king list, and it carries the same weight and the same limits. The long reigns of gods and demigods, scholars say, are mythological inflation, a way of dignifying origins, not a record of literal events. The threefold scheme of gods, demigods and men is theology, not history, and this is reasonable. No one need believe that falcon-headed gods literally governed Egypt for tens of thousands of years. But the reasonable explanation does not dissolve the deeper pattern, and the deeper pattern is genuinely strange. Why should two of the earliest literate civilizations on Earth, raising their cities thousands of miles apart, both independently structure their understanding of the past in the same way, with the same insistence that human history is recent and shallow, and that beneath it lies a vastly older age ruled by beings greater than men? It is possible that this is simply how the human mind organizes deep time, that any culture confronting the abyss of the past will fill it with gods and giants. It is also possible that both peoples were preserving, in their different idioms, the same underlying intuition, the same inherited conviction that there had been a world before theirs. The Palermo stone deepens the puzzle in its own quiet way. It is a fragment of a large slab of black stone carved in the time of the Old Kingdom that recorded the kings of Egypt and the events of their reigns going back to the very beginning, and in its uppermost register where it is most damaged, it lists pre-dynastic rulers, the kings who came before the unification of Egypt, before the first dynasty, in the shadowy ages at the root of the kingdom. These pre-dynastic kings are not gods. They are presented as men, with names who ruled in the time before the historical record properly begins. They are mostly names now, and little else, fragments of memory of a deep Egyptian past that left almost nothing behind. but their presence on the stone is testimony that the Egyptians themselves believed their history reached back further than their dynasties, that there were rulers and an order of things in the dim ages before the pharaohs, and that these had once been worth recording. So the two oldest literate traditions on the planet converge on the same haunting claim. Before us, they say, there was another age, longer and stranger than our own, ruled by beings or by men whom we no longer clearly remember. The Sumerians drowned that age in a flood. The Egyptians dissolved it into the reigns of gods, but the shape is the same, and it is the shape that the oldest writing on earth keeps returning to, as if compelled. And in Egypt, the question becomes especially sharp because Egypt left behind not only words but stone, monuments of such scale and precision and antiquity that the dating of them has itself become a battleground. For there is one monument above all others around which this whole question of a forgotten elder age has crystallized, a monument that some have argued is far, far older than any dynasty of any king, older perhaps than Egyptian civilization itself. It crouches on the Giza plateau, weathered and silent, staring east toward the rising sun, and the marks upon its body have started an argument that will not end. The Great Sphinx of Giza is conventionally dated to the reign of the pharaoh Khafre, builder of the second of the Great Pyramids, which would place its carving at around 4,500 years ago. This is the orthodox view, supported by the proximity of the Sphinx to Khafre's pyramid and causeway, by a statue of the king found in the associated temple, and by the broad consistency of the monument with what is known of the Old Kingdom. For most Egyptologists, the matter is essentially settled. But beginning in the late 20th century, a challenge arose that has refused to go away, and it came not from an Egyptologist, but from a geologist, and it concerned not the style of the Sphinx, but the weathering on its body and on the walls of the hollow in which it sits. The Sphinx was carved from the living bedrock of the plateau, cut down into the limestone so that it sits within an enclosure, a sort of quarried trench surrounding it. The geologist Robert Schoch examined the weathering patterns on the walls of that enclosure and on the body of the Sphinx itself, and he concluded that they did not look like the weathering one would expect from wind and blowing sand in the dry desert climate of dynastic Egypt. They looked, he argued, like the weathering caused by prolonged and heavy rainfall, deep vertical fissures and rounded, undulating profiles of a kind that running water carves into rock over long ages. But Egypt has been arid for thousands of years. For rainfall to have shaped the Sphinx enclosure to that degree, Schoch reasoned, the carving would have to predate the onset of the desert climate, pushing its origin back not centuries but millennia before Khafre, into a wetter epoch thousands of years earlier than anyone had imagined. The idea had been championed before him by the independent researcher John Anthony West, who had seized on the water weathering as evidence of a lost antiquity, and together their argument reached a wide audience and provoked a furious response. The mainstream rebuttal was vigorous and detailed. Egyptologists and many geologists argued that the weathering could be explained without any great antiquity at all. The particular limestone of the Sphinx, they pointed out, is soft and prone to rapid erosion, and weathers in distinctive ways through the action of salt and humidity, and the simple flaking of a porous stone, processes that could produce the observed profiles within the conventional time frame. They noted that the desert climate of dynastic Egypt was not wholly without rain, that there were wetter intervals even within the historical period. They argued that the archaeological context, the surrounding tombs and structures, and the overwhelming weight of Egyptian chronology left no room for a sphinx thousands of years older than everything around it, a monument that would have to have been carved by a civilization for which there is otherwise no trace. To accept the early date, they said, was to conjure an entire lost culture out of nothing but the shape of some cracks in a wall. The debate has never been cleanly resolved, in part because the two sides are often arguing about different things. The geologists who support the water weathering interpretation are making a claim about erosion that other geologists dispute on geological grounds, a technical disagreement about how limestone weathers under different conditions. The Egyptologists are making a claim about context and culture, that the broader evidence simply does not permit so ancient a sphinx. A careful listener will notice that the early date has never been accepted by the mainstream, that it remains very much a minority position, and that extraordinary claims about lost civilizations demand evidence far stronger than contested erosion patterns. There is no inscription naming an older builder, no settlement of the right age, no tools, no bones, nothing but the weathering and the argument over what it means. Caution is more than warranted. The honest summary is that the Sphinx is most likely the work of the Old Kingdom, and that the case for a far older origin, however intriguing, has not been established. And yet, the Sphinx earned its place in this larger story, not because the radical date is proven, but because of what the controversy reveals about the questions underneath. The dispute over a few millennia of weathering is, at bottom, a dispute about whether human civilization might be older and stranger than the standard account allows. It touches the same nerve that the Sumerian king list touches, and the Egyptian dynasties of gods, and the symbols at Göbekli Tepe. It asks whether the monuments and memories of the ancient world might contain, encoded in stone and in the worn-down language of myth, the trace of something that preceded the civilizations we know. The Sphinx is compelling precisely because it sits at the intersection of the verifiable and the unprovable, a real monument of immense antiquity whose true age can be argued but whose silence cannot be broken. It will not tell us when it was made. It only stares, eroded and patient, while the living quarrel over its years. What gives the question its grip is that the ancient Egyptians themselves, as we have seen, believed in a deep past beyond their dynasties, in the followers of Horus and the long ages before the first king. If a people who built such monuments and kept such records insisted that there had been an elder age, then the impulse to look for its traces in the oldest stones is not mere fantasy. It is, in its way, simply taking the ancients at their word. The danger lies in filling the silence of that elder age with whatever we wish to find there, in mistaking a longing for a lost civilization for the evidence of one. The discipline required is to hold both things at once, to take seriously the possibility of a forgotten antiquity while refusing to invent it, to keep asking the question without pretending to an answer the stones have not given. And there is one source from the ancient world that does more than hint at a lost civilization, that names one outright, that gives it a story and a fate and a date, and presents the whole account as sober history received from the priests of Egypt themselves. It comes not from Egypt or Mesopotamia, but from Greece, from the writings of a philosopher who claimed to be passing on a tradition far older than his own people, a tradition about a great civilization that had risen and flourished and then, in a single terrible day and night, been swallowed by the sea. The philosopher was Plato. The civilization, he said, was called Atlantis. And the most overlooked part of his account is not the lost island at all, but what the Egyptian priest is said to have told the visiting Greek about memory, and about why the world keeps forgetting. The story comes down through two of Plato's late dialogues, the Timaeus and the Unfinished Critias, written in Athens nearly 2,400 years ago. In them, Plato has a speaker recount a tradition supposedly brought back from Egypt by the great Athenian lawgiver Solon, who had lived about 2 centuries earlier. Solon, the story goes, travelled to the Egyptian city of Sais and fell into conversation with the priest there, who kept records of immense antiquity. And when Solon tried to impress them with the oldest legends of the Greeks, the priest gently corrected him, and what they are said to have told him is, in many ways, more striking than the tale of Atlantis that follows. You Greeks, the eldest priest told him, are all children. There is no such thing as an old Greek. By this the priest meant that the Greeks possessed no truly ancient memory, no records reaching back into the deep past, only stories of recent ages dressed up as antiquity. The reason, the priest explained, was catastrophe. There have been, and there will be, many destructions of mankind, brought about by many causes, the greatest of them by fire and by water. When destruction comes by fire from the heavens, those who live in the mountains and high dry places perish, while those near rivers and the sea survive. When it comes by flood, the opposite happens, and it is the herdsmen of the hills who are spared while the cities of the plain are drowned. And each time the world is swept clean, the survivors are left without letters, without learning, the illiterate and uncultured remnant who must begin again from nothing, like children, knowing nothing of what came before. So civilization is repeatedly destroyed and repeatedly reborn in ignorance, and the cycle erases its own memory, and only in a few protected places, the priest said, where the records are kept safe in the temples and the destructions are gentler, does the long memory survive. Egypt, the priest claimed, was such a place, sheltered by its river and its climate, and so its temples preserved the chronicles of ages that the rest of the world had entirely forgotten. Set aside Atlantis itself for a moment and consider only this. Whether or not Plato invented the whole account as a philosophical fable, which many scholars believe he did, the framework he chose to give it is the same framework found in Sumer and in Egypt and in Göbekli Tepe and in the geology of the Younger Dryas. It is the framework of recurring catastrophe, of a world periodically destroyed by fire and flood, of survivors left ignorant who must rebuild from scratch, and of memory surviving only where it has been written down and kept safe against the next destruction. The Egyptian priest, in Plato's telling, gives almost exactly the explanation that the Mesopotamian story of the buried tablets gives, and that the very existence of writing implies. The world forgets because the world is repeatedly destroyed, and the only defense against that forgetting is the durable record, sealed in a temple, hidden in the ground, pressed into clay or carved into stone, waiting to outlast the catastrophe that will otherwise erase everything. And only against that background does the story of Atlantis make its full sense. The priest tells Solon of a mighty civilization that existed 9,000 years before, a great power beyond the Pillars of Heracles, on an island larger than Libya and Asia combined, which had conquered far and wide until it was defeated by the ancient Athenians, and which then, in a single dreadful day and night of earthquakes and floods, sank beneath the sea and vanished utterly, leaving only an impassable shoal of mud where it had been. The date the priest gives is remarkable, 9,000 years before Solon, which places the destruction of Atlantis around 11,600 years ago, astonishingly close to the date of the building of Göbekli Tepe and the end of the Younger Dryas, though almost certainly by coincidence, since Plato had no way of knowing those dates. The detail that matters is not the lost island, whose historical reality almost no scholar accepts, but the structure of the claim. A great civilization far older than recorded history destroyed in a single catastrophe of flood and earthquake, remembered only because the Egyptians wrote it down. Most scholars regard Atlantis as Plato's own invention, a moral parable about hubris and the fate of arrogant empires, dressed in the costume of ancient history to lend it weight. There is strong reason to think so. Plato was a philosopher, not a historian, and the Atlantis tale serves his philosophical purposes too neatly to be taken at face value, and no independent record of such a place has ever surfaced, and the geography is impossible. The sober verdict is that Atlantis never existed, that it is a literary creation, and that to hunt for it on the seabed is to mistake a parable for a map. And yet even those who are certain Atlantis is fiction must reckon with the priest's speech that frames it, because that speech is not really about a sunken island at all. It is a theory of history, and it is the same theory that the oldest writing on earth keeps quietly proposing, that the past is far deeper than it appears, that civilizations rise and are destroyed and rise again, that each destruction wipes the memory clean, and that we, who think ourselves the heirs of the whole human story, may in fact be the children the priest described, living in the latest cycle, knowing almost nothing of what came before, our supposed antiquity only the most recent in a series of beginnings. The unsettling power of Plato's framing is that it does not depend on Atlantis being real. It depends only on the observation that memory is fragile and that catastrophe is recurrent, and both of those are simply true. The earth has been struck by impacts and convulsed by floods and shaken by earthquakes throughout human existence. Civilizations have risen and fallen and been forgotten. Cities have been swallowed by sand and jungle and sea. Whole languages have died with their last speakers, taking everything written and unwritten with them. The priest's claim that the world keeps forgetting is not a fantasy. It is the literal condition of human history, and the oldest writing exists precisely because some people, at some point, understood it and tried to fight it. The deeper question Plato leaves hanging is how much has already been lost in the gaps between the cycles, in the long illiterate intervals after each destruction, before anyone learned again how to write. And to feel the weight of that question, one need not imagine any sunken island at all. One need only count the libraries that have actually burned. There is a particular grief that belongs to no funeral, the grief for knowledge that once existed and exists no longer, for the words that were written and then unwritten, burned or buried or simply allowed to rot until no living mind retained them. It is a grief without a body, and it is the largest loss in human history, far larger than any war, because what dies in the destruction of knowledge is not one life, but the accumulated understanding of generations, the slow harvest of countless minds, gone in an afternoon of fire. And the most famous emblem of that grief is the Library of Alexandria, which has become a kind of shorthand for everything humanity has forgotten. The truth of Alexandria is more complicated and in some ways sadder than the legend. There was no single dramatic night in which the great library burned and all of ancient learning perished in one blaze, though that is how it is often told. Instead, the library declined and was damaged across centuries, by fire during the wars of Caesar, by the gradual withdrawal of royal support, by neglect and political upheaval, and the slow attrition of a fragile institution in a turbulent world, until at some point its great collection ceased to exist. The loss was not one catastrophe, but a long erosion, a death by 1,000 cuts, and that may be the more important lesson. Knowledge does not usually vanish in a single spectacular fire. It seeps away. It is not recopied because no one can read it, or no one cares, or there is no money, or the language has changed, and one generation simply fails to pass on what the last one knew, and the silence closes over it. By the most sobering estimates, the overwhelming majority of all the literature ever written in the ancient world is lost, not destroyed by any villain, but simply not carried forward, the text crumbling unread until the last copy fell apart. But there were also deliberate destructions, moments when the burning was a choice, and these are the ones that haunt most sharply, because they reveal a recurring human impulse to erase the memory of others. In the 16th century, in the Yucatan Peninsula, a Spanish bishop named Diego de Landa gathered the sacred books of the Maya, the painted folding manuscripts in which that civilization had recorded its astronomy, and its history and its rituals, and he had them burned. The Maya, he wrote, possessed a great number of these books, and because they contained nothing in which there was not superstition and falsehoods of the devil, he burned them all. And the people, he noted, regretted this to a surprising degree, and it caused them great affliction. With those few sentences, De Landa recorded both his crime and its cost. The Maya had a full system of writing, one of the few ever independently invented anywhere on Earth, and they had used it to fill libraries. Of all those books, only a handful survived the fire and the centuries. 4. From an entire literate civilization, 4 books remain. Everything else the Maya wrote, the bishop and time together destroyed. Consider what that single example implies about the deeper past. The Maya were not obscure. They were a major civilization, encountered and documented by the very people who destroyed their books, and still nearly the whole of their written record was annihilated within living memory of its making. If that could happen to the Maya, in the full light of recorded history, with witnesses and survivors, how much more easily could the records of older and more distant peoples have vanished without anyone to mourn or even notice? The Etruscans, who ruled much of Italy before Rome, had their own literature, their own sacred books, and they too are almost entirely lost, surviving mainly in fragments and in the things the Romans chose to remember about them. so that an entire civilization speaks to us now in a language we can barely read, through a handful of inscriptions and the words of its conquerors. Again and again the pattern repeats. A people writes. A conqueror or a zealot or simply the passage of time erases the writing, and what remains is silence, or the version of the story told by whoever survived to tell it. This is the engine of the great forgetting, and it gives the Egyptian priest's claim its terrible plausibility. Memory does not merely fade, it is actively destroyed, sometimes by catastrophe, and sometimes by men, by those who conquer a people and find it convenient to erase their past, by those who hold a new faith and regard the old knowledge as error to be purged, by empires that rewrite history to flatter the victors, by institutions that decide which texts are worth copying and let the rest die. The history that survives is not a neutral record of what happened. It is a heavily edited remnant, shaped by who held power, who controlled the temples and the libraries and the scriptoria, who decided what was worth preserving and what was dangerous or worthless and best forgotten. To read ancient history is always to read a survivor, and survivors are never the whole truth, and so the question the oldest writing raises grows sharper rather than softer. If a civilization as recent and as well documented as the Maya could have nearly its entire written legacy destroyed, then the idea that older knowledge, the knowledge of people further back, less powerful, less lucky, might have been lost almost completely is not a fantasy. It is the expectation. The default condition of the deep past is silence, broken only by the rare fragments that survive by accident or by the deliberate effort of those who, like the legendary survivor bearing his tablets at Sippar, understood how fragile memory is and tried to defend it. The wonder is not that so much has been forgotten. The wonder is that anything at all has survived, that a few clay tablets and a few sheets of papyrus and a few weathered stones made it across the gulf of time to be read again. They are the exceptions. The rule is oblivion, which raises one more possibility, the strangest of all, and the one that ties the scattered threads together. If knowledge is constantly being destroyed and rebuilt, if every civilization stands on the ruins of forgotten ones, then perhaps certain memories are too important to be allowed to die completely, and survive not as records but as stories, encoded in myth, carried in the only vessel durable enough to cross the dark intervals between the cycles. The memory of a destroyed world might outlast every library by becoming a legend, a flood story, an age of gods, a lost golden time, passed from mouth to mouth across the illiterate centuries until someone, at last, learned again how to write and set it down. And if that is so, then the flood myths and the ages of the world that appear in culture after culture across the entire planet may not be coincidence at all. They may be the most ancient surviving memory of the human species, the one thing too important to forget. Spread a map of the world's oldest stories across the table, and a pattern emerges that no single culture could have arranged. Almost everywhere that human beings developed mythologies, they told of a series of worlds, of ages that rose and were destroyed and gave way to others, of earlier humanities that no longer exist. The idea is so widespread, and appears in places so far apart that it cannot easily be explained as borrowing from a single source. Either the human mind, confronting the mystery of its own origins, naturally arrives at the same shape, or there is something real being remembered in many tongues across the whole of the species. In India, the ancient texts describe the yugas, a vast cycle of 4 world ages that turn like a great wheel through immense spans of time. There is the Krita, or Satya Yuga, the golden first age of truth and righteousness, when the world was whole and human beings lived long and virtuously. Then comes a decline, age by age, through the Treta and the Dvapara, each shorter and more corrupt than the last, until the present age, the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness and discord, the worst and final age of the cycle, after which the world will be destroyed and the wheel will turn again to a new golden dawn. The spans of these ages are reckoned in hundreds of thousands and millions of years. numbers that dwarf even the reigns of the Sumerian kings, and they encode the same fundamental vision, that the present is a fallen and diminished thing, that the true greatness lay in the deep past, and that the world has been destroyed and remade many times before. In Greece, the poet Hesiod, writing in a roughly the same era as the earliest king lists were being copied in the Near East, described the ages of man in almost the same descending order. First, a golden race, who lived like gods without toil or sorrow. Then a silver race, lesser than the first. Then a race of bronze, harsh and warlike. Then the age of heroes, the demigods of legend. And finally the present age, the age of iron, in which men labour and grieve and grow old, an age Hesiod plainly regarded as the most wretched of all, wishing he'd been born either before it or after it. Here again is the descent from a lost golden time, the conviction that earlier humanities were greater, the placement of the present at the bottom of a long decline. A Greek poet and an Indian sage and a Sumerian scribe with no knowledge of one another, all reaching for the same architecture of time. Across the ocean, in the Valley of Mexico, the Aztecs and the peoples before them held that the world had passed through a succession of ages they called the suns, each presided over by a different power, and each ending in catastrophe. One sun ended when its world was devoured by jaguars, another was destroyed by wind, another by a rain of fire, another by flood. The people of that age transformed, in some tellings, into fish. The present world in this reckoning was the fifth sun, itself destined to end in its turn, in earthquakes and hunger. The Maya, their neighbours, kept calendars of staggering depth, and likewise conceived of previous creations destroyed before the current one. A continent away from Greece and India, with no possible contact, the same idea, worlds created and destroyed in series, the present merely the latest, all the others gone. How is this to be explained? The most economical answer is that human beings everywhere face the same existential facts and reach for the same metaphors. Everyone grows old and declines, and so it is natural to imagine that the world too declines from a better past. Everyone has witnessed floods and fires and earthquakes, and so it is natural to imagine the world ending in such ways. The myth of successive ages, on this reading, is not memory but psychology, the projection of universal human experience onto the canvas of cosmic time, and its appearance across cultures reflects only the unity of the human mind, not any shared event. This is a serious and respectable explanation, and it may well be the whole of the truth, but there is a quieter possibility that lingers at the edges, and it is the one this whole inquiry keeps circling back toward. What if the recurrence is not only psychological, but, in part, historical? What if the worldwide memory of destroyed ages preserves, however dimly, the real experience of humanity living through genuine catastrophes, the end of the Ice Age, the rising of the seas, the abrupt convulsions of the Younger Dryas, the impacts and floods and volcanic winters that have actually punctuated human existence? A people who survive the drowning of their coastline, or the darkening of the sky after a great eruption, or the long cold that killed the herds, might carry the memory forward in the only form that could survive the illiterate centuries, as a story of a world that ended, an age that was destroyed, a golden time that was lost. And if many people survived many such events, the memories might converge, across cultures, into the shared conviction that the world has been destroyed and remade before, because, in sober geological fact, it has. The honest position holds both readings in tension, refusing to collapse into either. The myths are surely shaped by universal psychology, by the human tendency to gild the past and dread the future, and it would be reckless to read them as straightforward chronicles of real events. But they may also be shaped, at their deepest roots, by the actual catastrophic history of the planet our ancestors endured, and it would be equally reckless to dismiss that possibility entirely. The oldest writing on Earth, with its flood that ended an age, sits at exactly this intersection, where myth and memory become impossible to fully separate. The Sumerians wrote down the flood as record. We read it as legend. But somewhere between the two, in the long oral darkness before the writing, the line between the remembered and the imagined was crossed, and we can no longer see exactly where. And this brings the inquiry to its most humbling frontier, the place where even the surviving writing falls silent. For there are scripts that have come down to us across the millennia, real writing, made by real and sophisticated peoples that no living person can read. They sit in museums and in photographs, perfectly preserved, covered in signs that clearly mean something, that clearly encode the thoughts and records and perhaps the very stories we have been chasing, and they say nothing because the key has been lost. They are voices that survive the fire and the flood and the forgetting, and still we cannot hear them, because the people who could understand them are gone, and took the meaning with them into the dark. Along the valley of the Indus, in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, there flourished more than 4,000 years ago one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world, contemporary with Egypt and Mesopotamia, and in some ways more advanced. Its cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro and others, were laid out on grids with astonishing regularity, equipped with covered drains and public baths and standardized bricks, home to perhaps 1 million people across a territory larger than either Egypt or Sumer. These people traded across vast distances, weighed their goods with a precise system of standardized weights, and left behind thousands of small carved seals and tablets covered in a script. And that script, the Indus script, has never been read. Despite more than a century of effort by brilliant minds, no one can say with confidence what language it records, what the inscriptions mean, or even whether it is full writing in the sense of encoding speech, or some other kind of symbolic system. A civilization of 1 million people, builders of cities, masters of trade, speaks to us in a code we cannot crack. The reasons the Indus script resists are instructive about the fragility of meaning itself. The inscriptions are mostly very short, a handful of signs each, far too brief to allow the patterns that let scholars break other ancient codes. There is no bilingual text, no Rosetta Stone, no inscription that repeats the same message in a language we already know, which is how the hieroglyphs of Egypt were finally read, and the underlying language is unknown and may have no surviving descendants, no living tongue to compare against. So the script sits there, visible and abundant and utterly mute, the record of a great people who clearly had things to say and said them, and whose words have become, for us, pure pattern without sound or sense. They are not lost in the way the burned Maya books are lost. They are present and still unreachable, which is in some ways a deeper kind of loss. The Indus script is not alone in its silence. On the island of Crete, the Minoan civilization, the oldest in Europe, left behind a script that scholars call Linear A, used to write the Minoan language before the rise of the Greeks. A related and later script, Linear B, was famously deciphered in the 20th century and turned out to record an early form of Greek, a triumph of scholarship that opened a window onto the Mycenaean world. But Linear A, the older script of the Minoans themselves, remains unread, because the language beneath it is unknown and seems to be related to nothing that survives. The Minoans, who built the great palace at Knossos, who painted the leaping bulls and the dolphins, who dominated the Aegean for centuries, wrote in a language that died with them so completely that even though we can sound out some of their signs, by analogy with the later script, the words mean nothing to us. We can pronounce their writing and still not understand a single sentence of it. Far out in the Pacific, on Easter Island, the most remote inhabited place on Earth, there is a script stranger still called Rongorongo. It survives on a few wooden tablets carved with rows of tiny, intricate glyphs, human and animal and abstract forms, written in a manner that requires the reader to turn the tablet after each line, so that alternate lines are upside down. When Europeans arrived, they found the islanders no longer able to read these tablets, the knowledge having died with the priests and chiefs who once held it, lost in the catastrophes of disease and slave raids that devastated the population. Whether Rongorongo is true writing or a memory aid for chance remains debated, and it too has never been deciphered. On the loneliest island in the world, a people invented or inherited a system of marks, and then lost the ability to read it within their own history. A forgetting that happened not in the deep past but within the last few centuries, witnessed and recorded. A small and terrible demonstration of exactly how knowledge dies. And then there is the Phaistos disc, perhaps the single most enigmatic written object ever found. A small disc of fired clay from Minoan Crete, stamped on both sides in a spiral with signs that were pressed into the clay using individual punches, making it, in a sense, the oldest known example of movable type, produced thousands of years before printing was supposedly invented. The signs are unlike any other script. They appear nowhere else. There's not enough text to decipher, and nothing to compare it against, and so it has provoked endless theories and yielded no answers. A single perfect artifact of a writing system used, as far as anyone can tell, this one time, on this one object, for a purpose no one will ever know. It is the loneliest sentence in the world, a message stamped with care into clay more than 3,000 years ago, surviving intact across the millennia, and saying nothing we can hear. What these silent scripts teach is the most sobering lesson in the entire inquiry. Writing was supposed to be the defense against forgetting, the durable record that would outlast the death of the speakers, and yet here is writing that survived, physically intact and still failed in its purpose, because the meaning leaked away even as the marks endured. The clay lasted, the sense did not. To read requires not only the marks, but the living chain of people who know how to interpret them, and when that chain breaks, when the last reader dies, the writing becomes mere pattern, beautiful and mute. The Indus seals, the Minoan tablets, the Rongorongo boards, the Phaistos disc, all of them are proof that even the written word is not a guarantee against oblivion. That meaning is more fragile than the medium that carries it, and that a civilization can vanish so completely that its very words become unreadable, present and lost at the same time. This is the final shadow that falls across the oldest writing on earth, and across the strange insistence of the first writers that there had been a world before theirs. For if scripts only 4,000 years old, made by peoples we know existed, can become unreadable, then what hope is there of recovering anything from further back, from before writing entirely, from the lost ages the myths describe? The deep past does not merely keep its secrets, it dissolves them, until even the keys that might have unlocked them are themselves lost. And the people who first pressed reeds into clay, who wrote of kings before the flood, and sages from the sea, and a world that had been swept away, may have understood this better than we do. They were not recording their triumph. They were making a wager against the dark, casting their words forward into a future they could not see, hoping that someone someday would still know how to read them. And the only reason we know they made that wager at all is that, against impossible odds, in their case, it worked. Somewhere tonight, in the climate-controlled silence of a museum, the oldest writing on earth is resting in a case, as it has rested for years, as the clay rested for thousands of years in the dark of the mounds before that. The reeds that pressed those wedges decayed before the first pyramid was built. The hands that held the reeds returned to the dust of a country whose very name has changed many times since. The city those hands lived in is a low hill now, walked over by shepherds who do not know what lies beneath. And yet the words remain. The barley is still counted. The kings still reign their impossible reigns. The flood still sweeps over, in the present tense, every time a reader leans close enough to make out the marks. There is something in that which resists every attempt to be merely sad about it, something closer to wonder, that across such a gulf of time and ruin, the thought of a long-dead clerk can still arrive, intact in a living mind. The first writers, whoever they truly were, seem to have understood something that is easy to forget in an age drowning in words. They understood that to write is to refuse to disappear completely. Every tablet, Every inscription, every scratched symbol on a vinca pot or a stone pillar buried beneath a Turkish hill is, at bottom, a message thrown forward into a darkness the writer cannot see, a small defiance flung against the certainty of being erased. We were here. This is what we knew. This is what we feared and counted and worshipped and lost. Remember it, whoever you are, because we will not be able to tell you ourselves. The oldest writing describes a world before us not because its makers had special knowledge of vanished civilizations, but perhaps because they were the first to feel, with full force, the terror that lies at the root of all writing, the terror of the world that forgets, and to do the only thing that has ever pushed back against it. And so the strangeness at the beginning of this inquiry resolves, not into an answer, but into a kind of recognition. The first writers wrote about a lost world because they were afraid of becoming one. They had glimpsed, however dimly, the long darkness behind them, the ages with no records, the kings reduced to impossible numbers, the catastrophes worn down into the single word flood, and they understood that they too would one day be on the far side of someone's forgetting. They were trying to send a thread across that gap. The miracle is not that the deep past is lost. The miracle is that they tried at all, and that the thread, in their case, held, which leaves only the question that cannot be set down, the one that follows the listener out of the museum and into the dark of an ordinary night. If the people who invented writing already lived in the aftermath of a forgotten world, then what is this? What age is this that we so confidently call the present, the culmination, the most knowing time there has ever been? The Egyptian priest told Solon that the Greeks were children, that they remembered nothing truly old, that they lived in the latest of many cycles and mistook their brief memory for the whole of history. He was speaking supposedly 24 centuries ago, but the words do not stay safely in the past. They turn, slowly, to face whoever reads them. For every civilization that ever rose believed itself to be standing at the summit of time, the heir of all that came before, too vast and too clever and too well recorded ever to be forgotten. And every one of them was wrong, or will be. Their certainty is already half buried, their words already drifting toward the silence of the Indus seals and the Phaistos disk. Perhaps then the oldest writing is not really about a world before us at all. Perhaps it is a mirror held up across 5,000 years in which a careful watcher can see something uncomfortable and true, that we are not the end of the story but a chapter in it, like the Sumerians, like the Minoans, like the people of the Indus and the carvers of the buried pillars, each in their turn convinced they were the final word, each in their turn becoming the lost world that the next would struggle to remember. The flood the first writers described may have already happened, many times, in many forms, or it may be the name of something that has not finished happening, the slow tide of forgetting that rises behind every living moment, swallowing the past at exactly the rate that we create it. The clay does not say, it was never able to say. It can only hold its few wedged marks up to the light and wait, patient as it has always been, for a reader who can still make sense of them, knowing that one day there will be none, that the language will shift and the readers will die and the meaning will leak away as it always does, until the oldest writing on earth becomes, at last, what so much writing has already become, a beautiful and silent pattern, a voice with no one left to hear it. And in that long silence to come, the marks will go on saying what they have always said, to no one, in a tongue no one remembers, the same patient sentence pressed into the same enduring clay. There was a world before this one. There will be a world after. And someone in the dark between them was here, and counted, and was afraid, and wrote it down.